Good afternoon or evening or morning, depending where you are. I'm Philip Khoury, and I have the great privilege of chairing the Emile Bustani Middle East Seminar. We're in our 35th year, and it is sponsored by the Center for International Studies at MIT all these many years, and has been supported all these many years by the family of the late Emile Bustani, who was an MIT alumnus, class of 1933, and especially Myrna Bustani, his daughter. Let me just start by telling you our next seminar will be on April 13th, same time, same place, in this method. Alas, we hope starting in the fall, we'll be able to get back together physically. Hope springs eternal. But that seminar will be delivered by Ali Benwazizi, who is well known to many of you, at least in the Boston area and certainly in the Middle East studies world. And he's going to talk about US-Iran relations. What will it take on both sides to end the forever enemies stalemate? We look very much forward to that. Ali Benwazizi has spoken many times in the Bustani seminar over the last 35 years. And Eric Davis, who is our featured speaker today, has also spoken in this seminar. on several occasions. And I'm just delighted to have him back with us. Let me say I've known Eric for 47 years. We first met in Oxford in the fall of 1974 and became fast friends, and even used to drive down to London together to do research on our research projects, our doctoral dissertations in this case, in the Public Record Office in the center of London. And he is just a delightful person, much more than a colleague, a real friend. So he's going to talk about youth and the October revolution in Iraq between sectarianism and democracy. And let me just say a few words about his career. He is professor of political science at Rutgers University and has been there a good long while, a very senior position. He's one of our leading political scientists focused on the Middle East in this country. He also was past director of its Center for Middle Eastern Studies. His research has included the study of the relationship between state and power and historical memory in modern Iraq. He's written about the political economy of Egyptian industrialization, the ideology and social bases of religious radical movements in Egypt and Israel, and the impact of oil wealth on the state and culture in Arab oil-producing countries. So he ranges very far and wide across the region. He's been a fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford, at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, that is the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin, the Shelby Cullum Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton, and the Center for the Critical Analysis of Contemporary Culture at Rutgers itself. Eric picks the places he goes to or gets invited to with, may I say, excellent taste. These are all amazing institutions. Maybe most importantly, he was appointed a Carnegie Scholar for 2007 and 2008 by the Carnegie Corporation in New York. It's one of the most prestigious kinds of fellowships or scholarships one can receive in this country. And let me just stop there, other than to say he earned his PhD at the University of Chicago, where they take ideas very, very seriously. So Eric, but maybe before let me just say a word about how to use the Q&A function, or please do use the Q&A function of Zoom. That's for our audience. Feel free to do so by opening up and clicking the button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to add questions during the talk and afterward. And you can also like questions from others that you would like to hear answered. Questions will be answered by Eric at the conclusion of his talk. He's going to take roughly 40 minutes to tell us the story. So Eric, may we turn to you, sir? And thank you for being with us.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to Philip for that very kind introduction. It's indeed a pleasure to be back at the Bustani seminar and be able to speak to all of you on the topic of youth and the October Revolution in Iraq, from sectarianism to democracy. I want to mention before we go into the presentation that it's divided in 3 different sections. The first attempts to situate the October Revolution, or what's called in Arabic Thawra Tishrin, in its historical and socio-political context. And secondly, we're going to be looking at the goals and the activities of the October Revolution thus far. And finally, we want to talk a little bit about its accomplishments and what we can expect in the future. So my presentation is part of a larger project on extremist politics, which involves a book manuscript on youth and the allure of terrorism. But I became very interested while doing this research and writing the book about the number of youth uprisings that happened throughout the world, in which youth were demanding an end to corrupt governance, authoritarian rule, and the implementation of social democracy. And the Thawra Tishrin, or the October Revolution in Iraq, fits exactly into this category. So this question then becomes, why are some youth attracted to democratic politics, fighting for it in a peaceful way, not using violence, and being very vigorous and active in pushing this agenda, while other youth are attracted to extremist narratives? So those are the kind of big questions that frame this study. So the key questions we're asking again would be, why do some youth democratic support democracy and others extremist narratives? And can the Iraqi youth, as we'll see, many of whom have been killed and wounded, those who are fighting for democracy, can they succeed? And what has the Thawda Tishreen accomplished thus far? When we look at what the October Revolution wants, it represents a long series of protests against the Iraqi government, starting roughly around 2011. And these protests have consistently been a response to the fact that Iraq is a major oil producer, but still a country that suffers from a lot of poverty, a lack of jobs, and bad social services. So the focus until now has really been an end to state corruption and nepotism, more jobs for youth, improved social services. But more recently, with the October Revolution, we've seen a difference in this particular uprising, which, by the way, is the largest and most sustained uprising in the history of modern Iraq. As many of you know, Iraq became an independent country after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. It nominally became independent in 1921, although put under British sovereignty or British rule much of that time until the 1958 revolution. So when we look at what youth are asking for today, it really goes beyond better social services, the concern many Iraqis have with no electricity in the summer, which are increasingly becoming more and more hot. And without air conditioning, we have elderly people, children, sick people dying from the heat. So one of the demands has been a new electional law to assure fair and free elections and do away with what's called a muhassasa, or the quota system, which ends up making sure that dominant political parties retain their power, creating in effect what the authors Levitsky and Way have called a competitive authoritarian system. And competitive authoritarianism exists when you do have elections, but those elections are really stacked and the same people keep getting elected each time. Gender equality, as we'll see, is also a core component, and women have played a very, very important role in the October Revolution. And ending Iranian influence in Iraqi politics. And I would add to that, there's no desire for the United States to control Iraq either. So it differentiates, I would argue, the October Revolution from previous uprisings is that it has started out, much as the other protest movements did, but it is broadened to really now demand a complete reordering and restructuring of Iraqi politics and in many ways Iraqi society and culture. There were many things that led to the outbreak of the October Revolution on October 1st, 2019. But the straw that broke the camel's back, I would argue, was the firing of a national hero, Lieutenant General Abdul Wahab Saadi, who was key in leading the counterterrorism forces, which the United States helped train after the collapse of Mosul and much of north central Iraq, when it was seized by the Islamic State in June of 2014. And what was key about Lieutenant General el-Saadi's efforts was his unequivocal statement that he would not tolerate any sectarianism among the ranks of his troops. And when they did invade Mosul to expel the Islamic State, they did treat the people there who were very worried. I know we had students here in Iraq who called their parents in Mosul before the attack and said they were terrified because they thought General Abdul Wahhab's troops were largely Shia and they were Sunni. And then after at least the eastern part of Mosul had been liberated, these same students called their families again and they said, we've been treated with great respect, given food, healthcare. And as a result, the reputation of the Lieutenant General Abdul Wahhab spread throughout Iraq. And when, at Iran's behest, he was in effect fired on September 27, 2019, that was a key factor, a key tipping factor in the revolution. So what I want to also emphasize is that I think in the political science and other social science disciplines, not enough attention has been given this far to youth. As we'll see in a moment, youth are a very large demographic in Iraq. And here I just give you some examples of youth movements around the world, which have brought about some significant change, especially if we look at Sudan, which is involved in a 3-year transition to democracy, and Chile, which not that long ago passed a referendum by 57%, which did away with the hated neoliberal, which gutted the society of General Augusto Pinochet, the dictator who ruled Chile after the assassination of the democratically elected president Salvador Allende in 1973. And struggles can still continue in many areas. And beyond what you see here on the screen, we can also think about youth uprisings that are either underway or have been underway in India, Tunisia, Ecuador, Russia, Ukraine, and of course in the United States with the Black Lives Movement. So here we see two demographic from 2000 and 2025, in which we realize now why Iraq has what's called a youth bulge. Youth bulge means that roughly 70% of Iraq's population is under the age of 30, and there won't be a quote unquote more normal distribution of age distribution until 2050. Now, one thing quickly as a comment about the youth bulge, many social scientists say youth bulges are dangerous, but if we look at what used to be called the Asian tigers or the newly industrializing countries, you think of Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Malaysia, they had youth bulges too. The difference was they had economies that were developing and they could benefit from the large number of educated youth, whereas Iraq is really, in economical terms or economics terms, a monoculture. It is a country that depends for more than 95% of its revenues on oil production. And even though you have a lot of youth who are educated and have graduated from university, they are, as the American colloquial expression says, all dressed up with nowhere to go. So if you'll allow me to do a little bit of a historical memory lane exercise here, I'd like to go back to the US invasion of 2003. And whatever we think of that invasion, whether it was justified or not, it was certainly a lost opportunity. The United States empowered the sectarian politics that exist in Iraq today. It is not a function of Islam, the fact that 60% of Iraq's population are Shia, and maybe 40% the Sunni Arabs and the Kurds are the Sunnis, Arabs and Sunni Kurds are 40%. It's really that the United States put in power an elite comprised of what I would call sectarian entrepreneurs. These include people like Abdulaziz al-Hakim, who was, at the time he was given a power by the United States, head of an organization called the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which had been created in Iran in 1982 and led for 2 years by Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Another was Ahmed Chalabi, who was convicted in absentia in Jordan for looting the Petra Bank in 1967. Hadi al-Emiri, who was the head of the militia of the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, and later Nouri al-Maliki, who George W. Bush appointed prime minister in 2006 over the objection of many of his advisors. Many of these politicians had lived in Iran and all had close ties to it, and none supported creating democracy in Iraq. So putting these people in power belies the Bush administration's argument that they were trying to create democracy in Iraq. Nothing could have been farther from the truth. And we see these images from the invasion. Why was it that the only ministry that was really guarded was the oil ministry and the Ministry of Defense? And below, we see the looting that took place. In the upper right-hand corner, we see the Ministry of Culture that was completely trashed to the point that even copper piping was taken out so government employees couldn't come back to work. And of course, the horrors of the heritage that was destroyed in Iraq's famous National Museum. So why did the United States empower sectarianism in Iraq? First of all, there was a presumption that Sunni Arab leaders were seen as hostile to Israel and by extension to the United States. Of course, one of the mantras of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party was hostility to Zionism. But this was a very foolish position to take because there were many respected Sunni statesmen and non-sectarian leaders. For example, Adnan Pachachi, who recently died, and these people were completely ignored. And these expatriates who were come back to Iraq had lived outside the country for many years and were viewed by Iraqis as carpetbaggers. And many Iraqis, many of whom I know, who were only nominally Ba'athists because they had to become part of the party to be able to get a job, were dismissed, creating a great shortage of professionals. And again, we can talk a little bit more later on about the neoliberal component of all this, the so-called neoconservatives who were behind the invasion of Iraq, doing things like taking away agricultural subsidies to Iraqi farmers, which then made them totally non-competitive with fruits and vegetables coming in from Syria and Iran. So we could go on and on and on about the bad contracts, the billions of dollars that still haven't been accounted for. But I would argue that the occupation, American occupation of Iraq was a complete disaster. And here we see Abdulaziz al-Hakim meeting with George W. Bush, Nouri al-Maliki below, Dick Cheney and his close friend Ahmed Chalabi. And in 2011, a meeting in the Oval Office with President Barack Obama, in which Hadi al-Amiri, who's one of the leaders of the militia movement in Iraq, which is against the October Revolution and is really working on behalf of Iran in Iraq. We'll talk about him a little later on. So let's talk a little bit about the growing crisis of the Iraqi state. First of all, it's interesting to note that these two polls that were taken, one in 2010 and 2020, show a decline in support for democracy. And it's notable that in the first two elections in January of 2005 and December of 2005, and also in 2010, that we had very high turnout, close to 60%, higher than even turnouts in American presidential elections. And there was great hope. Many of the Shia thought because now you had Shia in power, they would work on behalf of the Shia community in Iraq, which Saddam Hussein had not done. The Sunnis who didn't vote, Sunni Arabs who didn't vote in the first election in January 2005, gradually came to see that this was a good idea for them to become involved. And in 2010, we had Ayad Alawi, who led a cross-national anti-sectarian coalition called Al-Iraqiyya, won 91 seats in the parliamentary election, to Nouri al-Maliki, a sectarian leader whose state of law coalition earned 89. And after Iran made threats against the United States, Barack Obama, not wanting to get more involved in Iraq, basically weaseled out of any kind of involvement and allowed Maliki to stay on for another term as prime minister, basically denying Alawi, who had won the elections, the right to become prime minister. This led to the disastrous seizure of Mosul and much of north central Iraq, 1/3 of the entire country, by the Islamic State in 2014. The problem with that was really that Maliki appointed his own cronies as leader of the army in Mosul in the north. They stole from the soldiers, forcing many of the soldiers to force the local residents to give them bribes. And this paved the way for the Islamic State to come in and take over the region. Now, we also see that despite the fact in much of the media in the West, there's a constant emphasis on the kind of different ethnic and religious groups in Iraq, Sunni, Shia, and Kurds specifically. But here we see that both in 2010 and 2020, Iraqis, like people everywhere, are most concerned about jobs and employment and security. And even sectarianism, which under al-Maliki in 2010 was at 11%, doesn't even appear in the poll in 2020. And here you see people having not a particularly optimistic view of the future. This is a poll from last August and September. And here I think it's stunning to see that 86%, with only 1% having no opinion, that 86% do not consider the country, namely Iraq, to be governed by a majority of people who are interested in their citizenry. And if you look here below, you'll see that parliament and political parties basically have no support whatsoever. Turning to some focal groups that I conducted in 2010, 2011 with a grant from the U.S. Institute for Peace, which I'm now trying to transform into a nationwide statistically significant survey, because these particular focus groups were organized with the assistance of US IP facilitators in various parts of Iraq. And so it really speaks more to lower middle and middle class Iraqis. So it needs not statistically significant, but nevertheless, these are exactly the folks I would argue who have been very active in the October Revolution. And you see that when we asked them how many times did you attend the Friday prayer, the khutbah, in the last month, 72% said never, and 8% said once. And those that went 4 times, many of them said the only reason they went was because they were forced to by their parents. And when we pushed them further on this, they said it's not that we're against religion. Many of them read religious texts and consider themselves religion, but they said we do not want to go to the mosque and hear a political sermon, which we think is in the interest of the individual preacher and not for the good of the country. We also see that most of them identified either as moderate or liberal, and even those who were conservative, nothing like a support for Al-Qaeda or Taliban, just more, I would say, on the order of Christian democracy after World War II in Europe. And here I think you can see that this generation, which was basically born, socialized after Saddam was overthrown in 2003, has a much more positive perspective on the future than the Iraqis who suffered under the horrible United Nations sanctions regime of the 1990s, which led to the collapse of the Iraqi economy and national education system, and was the severest sanctions regime imposed on any modern state. So under Saddam, Ba'athist ideology was suffocating, although I remember when I first went to Iraq for 2 months in May and June of 1980, of course, one of the first things I did was look for bookstores, and found many, many bookstores in downtown Baghdad. And all the books on Baathism were over in the corner, stacked up with dust on them. So it was obvious to me that there wasn't a lot of interest, especially talking to many Iraqis, in Baathism. And Baathism was really, after Saddam Hussein seized power in 1979, it was a cult of personality devoted to him. But after 2003, politics has been dominated by what I call a political class of sectarian entrepreneurs. They present themselves or try to represent themselves as Islamists, but their so-called religious ideology has been thoroughly delegitimated by their massive corruption and nepotism. And in Transparency International's list of most corrupt states, Iraq is 168 out of 180 on its list. So a major problem, I would say, facing all Arab regimes and many regimes in the Middle East and the global South, and indeed in the West, is its lack of ideology and its inability to present a vision for the future to its citizenry. Now, under Saddam's rule, few Iraqis believed in Baathism, even though they had to pretend to do so to get ahead and get jobs. But still, even with Baathism not being taken very seriously, it did offer a vision of the future, a vision that was deeply flawed and ultimately did not work, a pan-Arab vision. But it did present Iraq, because of its great civilizational depth, as primus inter pares, or first among equals, among Arab states. But the post-2003 political elite lacks an ideology. And its lack of ideology, combined with its massive corruption and nepotism, its complete disregard for the needs of the citizenry in large, is one of the key things that's allowed the Thawra Tishrin, or the October Revolution, to gain national support. Now here we see the groups that that oppose the October Revolution, known in Arabic as al-Khashad al-Shabi, or the Popular Mobilization Force units. These were formed after the Islamic State seized Mosul. Much of northern central Iraq was going to the south to take over potentially Baghdad. And Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani called upon people to organize militias, which they did. The problem was, after the Islamic State was defeated in 2017, these militias with funding from Iran have now become a deep state. They have become criminal elements, much along the lines of La Cosa Nostra, the 'Ndrangheta and the Camorra, the crime syndicates in southern Italy, which also started out as supposedly helping the population, but morphed into crime syndicates. So they are deeply resented, and they have been in the forefront of killing and attacking many of the youth who have been demonstrating. So here we see what happened when the revolution began. Security forces from the Ministry of the Interior, and also many of these Khashad forces, attacked and killed many protesters. Here we see, at a micro level, the father of one of them, this lawyer, Ali Ahmed Jassid, who searched for his son for a year. And when he was close, perhaps, to finding out what actually did happen to him after his son was kidnapped, he was recently killed as well. But if you look at what's going on from the point of view not of the state, the repressive side of things, you see here that youth have taken ammunition that was used to kill them, to shoot them, to wound them, and to date, it's estimated that well over 1,000 Iraqis have been killed. We don't know how many have been kidnapped, and many of them have been tortured. And probably the wounded is between 30 and 40,000. So there's been a great deal of violence bestowed on these peaceful youth demonstrators since they began their revolution in October of 2019. This picture here is just a number of those killed during the very first month of the revolution. And here we see others, the more notables. We'll talk about Safa al-Sarai, Hisham al-Hashimi, the really creme de la creme of Iraqi youth killed during this uprising. Again, demonstrators trying to return a kidnapped victim. And here you see that the revolutionaries, the youth who have been part of this, and they've been joined in large measure by many poor Iraqis, are not pushing a sectarian revolution, even though the majority of those who are involved are from the South, and thus they're Shia, because many of the Sunni Arab youth who sympathize have either not been able to because of all the disruption of their lives after the defeat of the Islamic State, or they don't want to get involved so that the politicians can call the revolution Ba'athist uprising. And to the right, you see the prime minister, who the revolutionaries forced to resign in December of 2019. And it says here, "Get out, you corrupt lackey of Iran." And you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, kicking Ayatollah Khamenei, the so-called supreme leader of Iran, out of the country. And to the right, the Arabic on top of the Turkish building, which we'll talk about in a moment, talks about a new generation. And I think this is one of the factors that needs to be taken into account as a driver of politics in Iraq, and also as a potential causal element in political change, namely the ability of youth today to rise up and do it on a global scale. Here, of course, we see Khamenei and his support for the popular mobilization units. So there's great anger among the militias. Here's Qasem Soleimani, who was killed by an American drone strike on January 3rd, 2020, and Khamenei. And down here we see a militia leader called Muqtada al-Sadr, the son of a beloved Ayatollah who was assassinated by Saddam Hussein, along with Muqtada's two brothers in 1999, meeting with Khamenei in Iran. And Muqtada al-Sadr is revered by a lot of poor Shia who live in a northeast segment of Baghdad, very poor quarter called Sadr City, used to be called Revolution City. And originally he supported the uprising of the youth, but then when he saw many of the Khashed or mobilization, popular mobilization units killing and attacking the demonstrators, because Iran does not obviously want to see a real democracy established in Iraq, to prevent himself from being outflanked, he kind of did a 180 and started sending some of his fighters in to actually no longer support, but to fight against the October Revolution. That was also when he saw that the revolutionaries were not going to allow him to take over their movement. I want to talk quickly about tolerance in Iraq, and I think there are some important issues to speak here. That in Iraq, among Arab tribes especially, all have mixed Shia and Sunni clans. There's been a high level of intermarriage over a long period of time that dipped after 2003, but it's returning today. We have a great legacy of the Iraqi Communist Party, which is not a communist party as you might initially think. It's really a party that 95% of the people who joined it never read Marx or Lenin, but joined it because of its emphasis on social justice, its anti-sectarian mission, the important historical transmission of memory, homeschooling, because the culture of Iraq, I would argue, prior to the coming to power of the Ba'ath Party, the first one in 1963, and then Saddam's wing in 1968, was really one of great tolerance. And also there's a generational impact of the Ba'athist legacy. Going back to that slide where you see the difference between the 12 to 18-year-olds and the 25 to 30-year-olds, you can argue that many of young Iraqis today don't remember the Ba'ath. And this has really allowed them to break the barrier of fear, which has been helped by social media. And it's allowed them to explore the pre-Ba'athist past, much of that on social media. For example, a very tolerant coffee house culture, the Maqahi al-Sha'abiyya, and popular heritage, Turath al-Shabi, which really emphasizes an Iraqi unity or unified political culture. Here we also see the way that many Shia have identified with Christianity, because both religions embrace martyrs, Christ here and Imam Hussein. Of course, we see this historic meeting in the upper right-hand corner between Pope Francis and Ali al-Sistani recently, and how when the Islamic State and terrorists in Baghdad were attacking Christian communities, how the Shia and Muslim clerics came to their support. Art plays a great role in the Iraqi identity. If we look at the upper right hand, we see it says, we see the future even from the darkest corners or the darkest reserves. The protest tree that has been made from Iraqi flags. And this graffiti here, which says, the first time I understood the meaning of the nation or what a nation means. And again, the fact that Iraqi artists have created great symbols. And I could speak about the role of symbols that my colleague in my department, Dr. Jan Kubik, emphasized in the very interesting title of his book, the power of symbols versus the symbol of powers versus the power of symbols. So in other words, using symbols against the state. And here we see in this particular painting, the use of the word amagai, which is from ancient Sumerian, and it is in fact the first time in recorded history that freedom was used in the sense that we understand it today. And here we see a very famous monument, which is iconographic in Iraqi protests since 2003. Jawad Salim, who lived from 1919 to 1961, this beautiful monument in Liberation Square in the center of Baghdad, which traces 3,000 years of Iraqi history, but doesn't focus on the rulers, the leaders, the wealthy, but indeed focuses on the peasants, workers, artisans who contributed to creating Iraqi society. And you can see how his Freedom Monument plays a role in other paintings. And here, the poet Safa al-Sarai, a BA in biology, who was killed in the first month of the uprisings, devoted his life while he was still living to helping others and has become a major symbol of the revolution. Civic engagement has been pushed. The state doesn't provide social services, so the youth have provided medical care. Here it says the emergency of the Thawr, but they put up health clinics all over squares. They've cleaned up garbage. They've provided food. They provided medicine. They've even passed out lots of documents on how to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, because to date, there really haven't been any shots given to Iraqis because the healthcare system is under the control of Muqtada al-Sadr's political party, and it has been since 2007. And when I was in Iraq in 1980, Iraq had one of the best healthcare systems in the entire Middle East. The majority of physicians in Baghdad were women. And today it is a shell. Only 2.5% of the budget is spent on healthcare. We see here how the revolution started its own newspaper, how it got support from labor unions, how it's mobilized large numbers of youth. Here again, we see the Freedom Monument in Baghdad, in Basra, in Al-Nasiriyah. And here in a building that was bombed out in 2003, which become iconographic of the lack of any concern, because this building was left destroyed until the youth took it over and changed its name to Batal al-Ahud, or Jabal al-Ahud, which is the mountain of al-Ahud, which is a famous battle in Islamic history. And they created a mosque inside, a restaurant. People donated rugs so people could sleep there. They even had internet, so people would come there because they couldn't get internet in their houses. As I said, providing lodging for people until it was finally taken over by the government. Gender equality is a key component. A lot of people have been shocked. Muqtada al-Sadr tried to get people to prevent women from joining young men, because these are men and women who have no familial relationship, but women have been out demonstrating with men. And it is something that reflects the new spirit of the youth, who really don't view those kinds of traditional gender roles as sustainable any longer. I know one of my colleagues told me that sometimes a mom will come with her daughter to a demonstration to make sure everything's on the whole, working out on the whole. But women have played a very, very central role in the October Revolution. And here you even see the kind of Rosie the Riveter. So we see also how social media has affected what's going on. And of course, the tuk-tuk, which is a three-wheel taxi, which is very inexpensive, which has become kind of the ambulance of the revolution because it has been used to take wounded demonstrators because it's small through alleys to hospitals. It delivers food to them. It's run by young men, for the most part, between 16 and 24. And this tuk-tuk revolution is another name that's been given to the October uprising. Will the October uprising or the October revolution create a democracy in Iraq? To be very honest, I think this outcome is unlikely in the near future. But the key thing I would argue is that the revolution has mobilized a counter-hegemonic vision for Iraqi's future. And it's a vision that the vast majority of Iraqis can believe in. Better social services, a government that rules in the interests of the people, a government that eschews corruption and nepotism, and a government that sympathizes with the problems of the people at large. And it defines this uprising, I would argue, an inclusive, tolerant identity, which is based on gender equality, religious and cultural freedoms, and personal freedoms. And I would say that ideas always precede action. With 70% of the population under the age of 30, this is the generation in waiting. Obviously, not all of the youth under age of 30 are supporting this revolution, but a very large group of them are. And as the Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci argued, you need to have organic intellectuals of any revolutionary movement. In other words, before that movement can impose its vision, in this case, the youth would like to do it through democratic elections, there has to be a vision which people can find to be counter-hegemonic to the would-be hegemonic vision or lack thereof of the existing political class. So the youth uprising in Iraq will continue. The global youth movement for greater democracy, I would argue, will only intensify. At the same time, we will continue to see increased corruption and nepotism, confronting a lack of economic growth and jobs. So we have 1 million young Iraqis entering the job market every year, and the government is basically doing nothing about it. I would argue that the majority of the older generation supports these youth protesters, so the struggle has just begun. And to end this lecture, I would say to be continued. And I'll just end on this note, which is a slide I like to show at the end of my presentations. And I'd be happy at this time to answer any questions people have.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Eric, very much. That was really comprehensive and learned a lot, enjoyed it. I wish I could have your data sets there to, peruse a little more closely, but that's fine. Maybe we could begin. I saw a question here from our colleague, Michael Fisher. I just need to find it. Here we go. Could we start with this question? I'll just read it and
Sure.
You take over. So what is the outflow of educated youth and where do they go? And are they still finding jobs in the Gulf?
Well, I'll read a quote. It says, as one protester put it, he said, "This is a generation that is not afraid to lose its life because it hasn't yet tasted it." So even when youth are in the university, and Iraq's university population is doubled since 2003, and by the way, a lot of these students are women in colleges in the southern part of Iraq, where women can go to college and come home at night. 70% of the enrollees are women. So they already know before they get their degree that there's not going to be a job. To give you an example, recently a PhD in electrical engineering, went to the Ministry of Education to try to get a job and was told, sure, we have a job for you, but it's going to cost you the equivalent of $5,000 in bribe money. And so instead, he's working in construction today. I don't think it's really possible, as it was in the past, to go to the Gulf any longer, because I don't think the kinds of employment opportunities that were there exist in the same way they do before. And especially since I know many people in the Gulf would be suspicious of some of these youth because they would feel that they might have democratic inclinations that would not go along with, again, what still is pretty much an authoritarian political culture in the Gulf.
Great. So staying with Michael Fisher, by the way, who Eric is my colleague in the Science, Technology, and Society program at MIT. So he asks, well, first he asks, and what can we say about cultural organizing abroad? And let me just continue. And then he says, it's been reported that doctors and professionals have been targeted for assassination. Is that continuing? And what can you say about that political dynamic?
Well, there was obviously, when the Islamic State, when Zarqawi was around, an effort, self-conscious effort, which led to an exodus of many professionals to kill them so that the Iraqi state could not make any kind of a transition to democracy. And let's go back again to the fact that the United States, one of the stupidest moves that it made was the decommissioning of the Iraqi conscript army. I've interviewed officers in that army who were Kurds, Shia, and Sunni, and they all said there were no problems. And getting rid of that army of 380,000 right after the toppling of Saddam allowed for this insurgency, these kinds of targeted assassinations to take place, because this army would have been able to really put that down. But I think the Bush administration wanted to get American oil interests into southern Iraq, wanted the Supreme Council for the Islamic Republic in Iraq's Badr militia to control that area. So he wanted to get rid of this conscript army. So that stopped after a while. It still occurs. We've seen very recently in Nasiriyah, for example, that lawyers who were supporting the October Revolution have been assassinated, but it's not on the level that it was before. But we do see is a lot of students from the medical schools, even though they've been told not to participate, serving a very, very important function, men and women, in helping the wounded and the deceased to be able to take them to morgues or give them medical aid if they've been wounded.
Great. So here, I think, is another question I'm just trying to find. What has been the role of the Kurds in the uprising, Eric?
Well, that's very interesting, because the Kurds are also demonstrating in the Kurdish regional government. As a matter of fact, the Kurdish regional government even has a lower support level in public opinion polls than the government in Baghdad. The same thing. Many Kurds have only received partial salaries, like employees in the South. And of course, one of the big problems in both the Kurdish region and Iraq is a government that's dependent upon oil, and the fact that 50% of the budget goes to paying salaries of political appointees and pensioners. So one thing that hasn't happened, but I think that it's beginning to happen to a certain degree, is the realization among Kurdish youth and Arab youth in the South that they have the exact same interests, that none of them are getting jobs when they're getting out of college, that they're facing same levels of corruption and nepotism, that there's the same complete lack of concern for the needs of the people at large. And should there be greater integration of the two movements, that could really, I think, propel important political change. But that's going to take a while, because of course the Kurdish region was apart from Saddam from basically 1991. But even though many people say Kurds don't speak Arabic, they still watch soccer games and Egyptian TV programs. And when I was there, uh, ran into very few people who couldn't at least converse with me in Arabic.
Great, thank you. That question, incidentally, came from Oliver Zafariu. So this is a question from Paul Arts at the University of Amsterdam. And he says, and it's really two parts, concerning the PMF, you seem to argue that all groups within the PMF are acting on behalf of Iran, and that seems to him a little unnuanced. And then related to the need of ideas, referring to Gramsci, which you did, what are the protesters' ideas with respect to the massive need for jobs, realizing the rentier character of the Iraqi state, of course?
Well, that's an excellent question. And of course, I was trying to rush through a lot of material. There is a smaller group of Khashad or PMF militias, which are directly allied with Ali al-Sistani, the Christians, even Yazidi women have formed their own militias. So it is definitely not correct to argue that all militias are loyal to Iran or under the thumb of Iran. But the most powerful ones, like Asab Ahl al-Haqab and Katab al-Hezbollah and others, are really the ones that are the most powerful. And what makes them, I think, much more dangerous is the fact there's an area in Babel province, the south of Baghdad, called Jurfa Sakhar, which even the prime minister can't visit because it is a criminal zone of illegally imported vehicles and other commodities. So again, I see a lot of parallels between Italy, where you had crime syndicates like the La Cosa Nostra, and 'Ndrangheta, La Sacra Corona, Camorra, form in the early to mid 1800s to protect the locals from far away, like the Bourbons and the Habsburg who were ruling southern Italy, but then over time became syndicates, and today still are controlling banks in Milan and are really very, very dangerous. And still the Italian government has not been able to get rid of them. The second question about the ideas, I think one of the problems of the October Revolution has been its somewhat decentralized character. That's made it hard to suppress, but there's no question that all the demonstrators are agreed in terms of their ideas. Only now have they begun with having forced early elections in October of 2021. They begin to form their own political parties. So it's important that they have their ideas, as Gramsci would argue, that they act in this way of serving as organic intellectuals. But at the same time, as many of my colleagues and myself as well have argued, until you institutionalize this uprising, until you gain seats in parliament, it's going to be very difficult to make change. We do have a party in the Kurdish region called Goran, or Tahrir, which stands for change. And they have won seats in the Kurdish parliament and the National Party parliament, and have been able to draw some attention to corruption. But they are still small, only have a few seats, so it's going to take a lot more organizing by Iraqi youth to really bring about meaningful change.
Thank you. So we have a question from Evelyn E. And Evelyn says, you mentioned the importance of popular heritage, in fashioning a new identity. How are such cultural and social elements as the tribe, the community, global cultural elements, pan-Arab satellite TV, teledramas, etc., part of the new mix in an emerging new identity? Thanks for a concise, comprehensive analysis. Thanking you generally.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of theater going on. There was a video game called, I forget, it's PUBH, Battleground. And when the revolution started, the prime minister at the time, Adel Abdel Mahdi, said, well, these kids are just acting out this popular video game. So what the Iraqi youth did is many of them dressed up as zombies. They dressed up in costumes which replicated the animated characters in the video game to make fun of the regime. I mention Turath al-Shabi, or popular culture or popular heritage, for the following reason. I think to date, if we look back at modern Iraq, there's only been one time when there's kind of been an ideology that captured the imagination of the majority of the Iraqi people, and that was during the time of General Abdul Karim Qasim, who ruled from 1958 until his overthrow by the First Ba'ath Party in 1963. He focused on two things. He did away with the pan-Arab component of the Iraqi flag, substituted the Star of Ishtar. He combined a focus on Iraq's contributions from ancient civilization. We all know about Hammurabi's Code. You can go to the US Supreme Court and the House of Representatives and see big murals to Hammurabi. The first writing, first language ever cuneiform, the first use of the word freedom, as I said, the first parliament that ever forced a ruler to come to it to gain approval for implementing a decision, in this case, war. And at the same time, he focused on popular culture, proverbs, tribal poetry. One of the first thing, and it wasn't so much Qasim, it was really the impact of the Iraqi Communist Party, particularly think of people like Faisal al-Samir, who was a minister of guidance at that time. He wrote a book called the Dawlat al-Zenj, or the Revolution of the Black People, which was the Zanzibarians who rose up and created a state in southern Iraq in the 800s for a few decades. So they went to Amara right after the revolution, Yusuf Saadi, the poet, and started tape recording the poetry of the Amara tribes. So it was an effort to really bring Iraqis together, not whether they were Shia, Sunnis, or Kurds, but to use this kind of pride in ancient Iraq and pride in popular culture in the modern period is something everybody could unify around. The problem was, of course, that Qasim was a dictator. Some might say, yes, he was a benign dictator who didn't like to execute people, but he was a dictator nevertheless. What we have today is the same type of focus, as you can see from the artwork. This focus on popular culture. You can see also the focus on drawing upon something that all Iraqis can have pride in. And we all know about Sidney Noah Kramer's great book, History Begins at Sumer, where he talks about the 34 firsts that Iraq gave to modern civilization. We can go to the Abbasid Empire and look at algebra, rudimentary computers, all the astronomers who named stars, the culture, the poetry. Modern times, Iraqis, the Sher al-Hor, or the free verse movement. I mean, there's a lot that Iraqis can be proud about in both their ancient Abbasid and modern history. But the difference between the Qasim era and today is that these youth want a democracy. They don't want a dictator. And that's what I think makes this a particularly powerful movement in terms of ideas. It brings together all Iraqis under a non-chauvinistic conception of nationalism, but in that table that they've set up, every ethnic group, every religious group has a seat.
Eric, just maybe building on your last point, not simply about the democratic inclinations of the youth, but that of all the countries in the Middle East, bar none really, Iraq has oil well. It has what did have, you will know better, a very good land to population ratio. It has two enormous river systems that, you know, for irrigation. I mean, if everything were equal, right? High level of education, and you mentioned women, doctors in abundance, but, you know, more, if I may, more freedom, more latitude for women, less repression than virtually any other. And I mean, there could be some exceptions there, but Lebanon, for instance, I would say they're freer and less repression, certainly. But, you know, for the region and for a country of that scale, the opportunities to join the developed world, the so-called developed world, were greater in Iraq than in any other country I know of. I think you would agree. You know, something went wrong. I mean, is it? I mean, the traditional argument had been that you have the various sects and the ethnicities, and there's no way, and the state was created, of course, it was patched together by colonial powers in an inappropriate and less than helpful way. But when you look at it, I mean, the sort of the big picture that you've been kind of alluding to in your talk, uh, what chance does it really have of reviving any of this, given its factors of production historically, modern historically, not ancient Sumerian or classic Abbasid,
Well, again, let's remember that the Ba'ath Party under Saddam came to power in basically a bloodless coup. They walked into the office of the prime minister and the president and said, here's a taxi cab to the airport, and sent them outside the country. And there were still cleavages in the Ba'ath Party, an attempted coup in 1973. But I would argue, had it not been for the 20-fold increase in oil price between 1972 and 1980, Saddam never would have had the opportunity to consolidate and basically co-opt huge segments of the population. But I remember being there in the in May and June of 1980 and traveling around the country. They were electrifying villages. They were teaching women, albeit propaganda, who were in their 60s and 70s to read and write. Saddam's regime won an award from UNESCO in 1988 for having raised the literacy rate in the country to 80%. They were hiring some of the best architects to create beautiful public housing with all sorts of Oriental motifs in Baghdad when I went there. Like I said, an incredible healthcare system, a university where the dean said they were given so much money that they didn't know how to spend it fast enough and were worried that they might be put in jail because people would think they're corrupt because they hadn't spent it and instead spent it on themselves. And had Saddam not invaded Iran in September of 1980, there might have been a possibility for a transformation of that country to a less repressive type. But certainly it was on pace to become one of the most developed and advanced countries in the region. I still think in public opinion polls fairly recently that Iraqis still rate very, very highly in entrepreneurial skills. And I'm directing a project with a number of incredible colleagues and wonderful youth in Iraq, Turkey, and Pakistan called Youth Social Entrepreneurship and Sustainable Development. And some of the things that some Iraqi youth have done, even in this period of incredible corruption, lack of growth, lack of using the oil revenues to really build a country, is truly remarkable. So I think that I still have a lot of faith in Iraq. And I think the fact that these youth were able to put together the largest uprising in the history of modern Iraq, not just in terms of the people who are participating, but keep it going. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has slowed it down. I just don't see this uprising ending anytime soon. And I just don't see the ability of the political elite being able to continue business as usual for the indefinite future.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. So we have a couple of more questions, at least two more for the moment. This comes from an anonymous attendee, and it's very brief. There are those who think that rule of law is much more important than democracy alone in progress. In the case of Iraq, how does it apply? I mean, how do you see it? I mean, is there a trade-off, or are the two, required to come together to really have progress?
Well, I would answer by saying we have a student at Rutgers just created an incredible dissertation on constitutional courts in post-Soviet Central Asian republics, which are not democratic for the most part. And certainly it's clear from that work, and I would argue that this applies elsewhere, and think of Tamer Mustafa's work on Egyptian courts, that you can have rule of law without having democracy. So we know Sadat put together a court system that was designed to assure property rights for foreign investors. Of course, that court became a little unruly, but still, no court can have real freedom if there aren't democratic norms at work. And I think we see that in the election of 2020 when our former president tried to subvert it and the court stood up. But it was really that checks and balances of democracy which allowed or prevented that person from implementing a soft coup.
Yeah. Good. So here's a question from Danny Postal. If the new oppositional political parties you mentioned succeed in winning seats in the parliament and perhaps even elect a prime minister, and the movement thus becomes institutionalized, as you say it must, what do you think the Iran-aligned militias in Iraq and Iran-aligned elements of the Iraqi state would do in response? Might they stage a coup, intensify their assassination campaign, target MPs? All of the above. I don't know.
That is a $64,000 question, because within several weeks of the October uprising, and indeed before the end of October 2019, so-called Supreme Guide Ayatollah Khamenei came out and said that these demonstrations were a U.S.-Israeli treasonous plot to take over the Iraqi state for imperialism. Of course, that's nonsense. The obverse is actually Iran uses Iraq as a conduit to Syria. It uses it as a way to get around sanctions, to launder money. And of course, it's establishing a huge illegal or illicit market, gray market, black market, whatever term you want to use in Iraq, which is outside the control of the government and of course, keeping the government from receiving a lot of revenues that it should have. So that, I think, is a big problem because in the Iraqi military, we still have many who are loyal to Iran. So it's not just the popular mobilization units, but the popular mobilization units, if there was an effort to dissolve them and incorporate them into the military, to give jobs to the young people who are in those militias, many of whom are in there only because they're poor. I think many of these militias are not really ideological. They're really more like employment agencies. There could indeed be an attack. On the other hand, there are cleavages within the militias. Which militia is going to be king of the hill? With the killing, along with Qasem al-Soleimani, of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis in January of 2020, the militia movement has fragmented somewhat. Soleimani was a brilliant tactician. He came to Iraq shortly after the October uprising began to tell everybody that Iran was on board to make sure it wasn't successful. And his killing deprived the pro-Iranian forces of a key figure. I wouldn't reduce it all to his influence, but that was a major setback, as was the killing of Mohandas, because that set off a fight within the militia movement. So it might be possible for some of the militias to find some type of ability to cut a deal with a new government. I think Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who has this kind of unique relationship of being a human rights activist for years, but also before he became prime minister, director of intelligence, that he is somebody who might be able to be used as a transitional figure. But the big concern, I would argue, is not really what would happen after the elections, but whether there's going to be an effort to really subvert the elections in October of 2021 to make sure that those who oppose Iran are not able to actually win seats by trying to steal the votes.
Great, thank you, Eric. So maybe one last question, and it comes from John A. And it is, among the problems of the Iraqi parliament seem to be the difficulty in forming a government, the time it takes, the compromises of the parties, in some sense, an excess of democracy. What can be done within the current Iraqi constitution? What reform might be possible?
Well, many people in the October Revolution have suggested that Iraq should adopt a presidential system and electoral districts, which are one past the post. In other words, if you get 50% plus one, you win the election. The problem with that is what the size should be. So the size in the electoral law that the parliament has passed to try to assuage the concerns of the uprising or the demonstrators, there still is no real census. So people are really nervous as to how these electoral districts would be drawn. But if there was a presidential system, and if there was a system built on the one past the post model rather than proportional representation, many people argued that that could be a system that would be more efficient. But in a sense, I think what you're seeing in Iraq in terms of what's called maybe an excess of democracy is also the fact that there are a lot of countervailing forces. And if we look at our own Congress, I should say the American, because obviously many of our viewers are not United States citizens, we see that our Senate can't pass anything, that there's a lot of what you call in France, immobilism, inability to move ahead. So at another level, I think the fact that there has to be all this negotiation is important. The problem is it's done as negotiation among the same cast of characters. It's the same corrupt politicians who keep putting together coalitions to make sure that they win. So I think the new law that's been passed by the parliament, that has to be based on a new census before it will make any sense. And electoral districts that are drawn, people have argued now, should be smaller so that you do not have the ability of these parties simply to use this new system to put together a list that could take over the electoral districts and come roaring back to control the system.
Terrific. Eric, on behalf of the Bustani Seminar and my colleagues at MIT, I want to thank you. You've just given us a really wonderful cut into Iraq, more than a glimpse of what is happening, and with a bit of a positive twist, as it were. And in these days, in that part of the world, little I can understand of it, it's very hard to find much optimism, and I hope you prove right. I think we all do.
Well, if I could make a last comment, I think the powerful ministry in authoritarian dictators is the ministry of not getting out of bed in the morning. So if people are going to just stay in bed and say, life blanks and then you die, nothing can be done. And unfortunately, I find a lot of that on social media that plays right into the hands of these people that are running the country. Once there's no more optimism, once there's no more plans for change, once there's no more effort to make a counter-hegemonic model, we might as well all just stay in bed and not get up in the morning because we've already ceded the political space to authoritarian rulers.
Hear, hear. Thank you. Have a great evening. Thanks everyone for joining us. And Eric, we'll get together somehow. Absolutely. Sooner than later, I hope.
Absolutely.
All the best to you, Donna. Bye. Take care. Thanks, everyone.